G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Dr. Rhys Crawley from the Australian War Memorial, and he has joined us today to talk about Australia's involvement in the Afghanistan War. Hi Rhys, thanks for joining us on the show.
G'day Adam, and good to be with you, and looking forward to seeing what happens here in this chat.
Thanks Rhys. No, I do appreciate you coming on and telling us a little bit about the Afghanistan War. So for our listeners, before we get into it, what was the key moment that ignited your passion in military history?
Yeah, I don't know that it was military history that really started. I mean, sort of been really interested in history in general for as long as I can remember. I grew up in Wollongong, which was a coal mining area, certainly in the suburbs I grew up in. And I remember in primary school getting this book from the school library, and it had all these then and now photos, so pictures from sort of back in the 1800s of the local coal mining district and the suburbs and the old buildings. And I was able to then sort of connect them with buildings that still existed, and it sort of really worked my imagination. And I just remember loving history from that moment on. And that just sort of grew into military history as well as a bunch of other things. But it wasn't really until I went to university that I think military history came to the fore as something that I wanted to pursue over and above other types of history. And it was in my second year of my undergraduate degree, I did a subject on Australia in the Great War at the University of Wollongong under Professor John McQuilton. And I just loved the subject. It was great fun. One of your guests you've had on here, and I know you know, is Dr. Carl James, who's the head historian at the War Memorial at the moment. So Carl was actually my tutor then, so he's a bit older than me. And I submitted an essay on the August Offensive at Gallipoli. So I read Charles Bean for that and a bunch of other books, and submitted this essay, which he didn't give me the best marks for. And I ended up doing my PhD on the August Offensive at Gallipoli. So hopefully I certainly passed that one. But yeah, it just sort of grew from there. A great subject and a great lecturer at uni. Decided to do a PhD in military history, and from there, got to work under Australia's top military historian, David Horner, on a non-military history subject. So I worked on the official history of ASIO, so about spies and catching spies. And it just sort of kept the military history stuff happening in the background. But yeah, I'd like to just call myself a historian rather than pigeonholing as a military historian. Anything from the past that's interesting is fine by me.
So what led to obviously you've given how you got into military history. So how did you end up at where you currently are at the Australian War Memorial?
Yeah, I guess my career has kind of set me up for the job that was advertised. So a job was advertised, I applied, and I was successful, which was great. But as I said, when I was coming to the end of my PhD, a job was advertised to work on an official history project. That was the ASIO project, and I was successful with that. So I had about 6 years working on official history there. And then I transferred to work still under David Horner on the official history of Australian peacekeeping, humanitarian and post-Cold War operations. And then when that concluded, and so I ended up being an author on both of those projects I've just mentioned. And then when that concluded, the job that I've currently got, so working on the official history of Australian operations in Afghanistan, that was advertised. I applied and got it. Now, I didn't really know anything about Afghanistan. I had done a PhD on the First World War. I had done some other stuff on the First World War, and I'd done stuff on spies, basically. So I had to retrain, but I guess all the processes we've been through with undergraduate university and postgraduate university, and then learning from the best people and surrounding yourself with the best people, you kind of have all the tools that you need, and it's just about picking up a new topic and applying that skill set and spending the time learning about a new topic. So that's how I got the job. I put in an application like lots of other people, and I'm part of a team now. So I like working as part of a team. I think I enjoy that more than just working by myself. So while I'm writing a big book on Afghanistan, so are other members of the team. And then I have some staff that work for me, but we work together on a book, and it's the product will have my name on it, but it will be as much their book as mine. I just get to own all of the howlers in it, and they can walk away from it. So that's lucky for them.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that you're writing the official history of Afghanistan, and some could say that you are the modern or equivalent of the Australian War Memorial's founder and First World War official historian Charles Bean. How is your official history project similar or different to his?
Yeah, I'll clarify this because it only probably matters for those who work on official histories. But Charles Bean was the official historian. So there's only one official historian at it, and that's the leader of the project. So I'm not that. My boss is the current day Charles Bean, and that's Professor Craig Stockings. And then under the official historian are people who write official histories. And so I'm one of those. And in my project, I'm one of 6. So I'm not the Bean equivalent. My boss is, and rightfully, he leads the project and he sets the tone. And he's written elsewhere, and this stuff can be found pretty freely online about the influence that, or otherwise, that Charles Bean has on his approach to official history. As I said, the official historian sets the tone. We write the books, and he wrote one of them as well. But that, to my mind, the Bean tradition can sort of still be seen in our work to some extent, and that is, Bean wrote a really exhaustive histories of the First World War, both as the general editor and the author of the majority of the volumes. But he had other historians and other authors working for him and with him. But it's exhaustive detail, but a feature of it is that it writes about the men in the trenches and the people at home, as well as the officers who make the decisions, and in a lesser extent in Bean, the politicians. And so we try, and I think all of the official history series since Bean have tried to do this, try to maintain that component of it being a sort of history of everyone, and making sure that there's enough of everyone's experience throughout the books that you can try and get a sense of what was going through the heads of those making the decisions, as well as those who are then implementing those decisions in battle. So to me, that's still there. I think the scale of the histories is pretty similar. I mean, Bean had 12 volumes, ours is 6, but I think the expectations of what we do in those from government who commission the histories, as well as the expectations we put on ourselves as the historians writing them, is pretty weighty as well. So we want them to be detailed accounts. They won't be sort of blow by blow accounts. We just don't have the size in the books to do that. Otherwise, the books will just be too unwieldy. But to me, I grew up. When you asked me a question before about when I sort of turned to military history, Bean was one of the first people I read, and in my PhD, I criticised Bean right throughout it. And so now I'm on the other side of that, and I got a bit more sympathy for what he was trying to do and some of the difficulties of doing that, because it's a really I think it's a pretty hard job, and the expectations, I certainly have pretty high expectations of myself in this. But yeah, it's there, and it's as important as it's been since Bean did the first official history series.
Would you agree, Rhys, and just off topic, that Bean, because the censorship that was around at the time, it actually made Bean's job harder?
Well, certainly as a journalist, censorship definitely applied to his work as a journalist, and he was pretty happy to abide by that censorship, and in a way that other journalists weren't. And I think when you read his press reporting from the First World War, you can see that coming through, where he would self-censor a lot of the time, which certainly made the censor's job easier. The censorship aspect's not so prevalent in his official histories. He was largely left to do what he wanted to do and to construct the histories as he saw fit, with access to the government records. And there's some limitations there. And we face some of those same limitations today. So it sort of gets to the question of what is official history. So it's not the government's view, and it wasn't the government's view when Bean wrote it. It was his view based on access to all of the official records. So official being government owned and created records. So the military was a government institution and its records are official records, as opposed to like someone's private diary or letters home, they're private records. So that's the distinction. And official history can have access to those private records, but it generally has access to the official ones before anyone else has access to them. So they're still sitting in an archive, they're closed to the public. Everyone listening to this, they can't go and request them and use them yet. So we get the first go at that. And there's some limitations on what we can write. Not what we can write. We can write whatever we want. We come up with the conclusions we want, but there's some limitations on what will eventually be published. So we can write and come to the conclusions we want. That'll go to various government departments, and they will read that and look through it generally for national security matters. And if it's anything other than national security matters, well, we'll push back on that. So there can't be censorship of our conclusions and of our opinions. There will be material that comes out because it will be sensitive for national security, but not sensitive because it's embarrassing, if that makes sense. And Bean and all his successors have had to grapple with this issue, and it's always landed in the favour of truth-telling rather than shying away from the uncomfortable components.
Absolutely, and a task that, I'm glad you've got it, Rhys, and I don't. And I take my hat off to you and everyone else in the team. Absolutely.
Oh, it's good fun. It's what we're paid to do, and we all take it really seriously. So.
Absolutely. And so, as you should, mate, we're talking about Afghanistan. And for the listeners, prior to September 11, 2001 attacks on the United States of America, few Australians would have known where Afghanistan was and what the significance was. Since we deployed to the operation, thousands of Australian defence personnel have served during and after the war in Afghanistan. What are some of the challenges you've experienced in researching this war, and how do you want it to be recorded for future generations?
It's a really good question. Doing history is never really easy, so there's always challenges, and I think each whether you're an official historian or otherwise, it's not easy if you want to do it well. One of the biggest challenges we're facing with this project is the records themselves. So partly that's in getting access to the records, so they don't sit in a warehouse somewhere in a box where you can go and talk to an archivist and request them. So the files still reside with the departments that created them. So most of those are owned by the Department of Defence, but others, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Attorney General's Department, whoever it might be, Prime Minister's Department or Cabinet. Now, eventually those records will go to the National Archives, but they're not there yet. So we have to deal with each of the departments and try and find their records. These are, if we think about, say, researching something from the First World War, it exists on paper somewhere, right? And an archivist has gone through and done the hard work of cataloguing what's in that box. And then those catalogues are published either online or you go to an archive and read them. That doesn't exist at the moment. So we have to find the records, and they're digital, so they're not paper records, which means you might have however many drafts of a particular document, but you won't know if you don't have access to the metadata, which is the most recent. So we're all guilty of it, right? We might have a folder on our computer that says Rhys's stuff, and in that might be draft 1, draft 2, final. If you get my drift. So the public service is guilty of that, and the military is guilty of that. And they've gotten better over time, but that's been a real challenge to sort of find that material and then sift through it. And just so much is created. I think of my own experiences researching the First World War. I wrote in my PhD, in my first book, I wrote a couple of chapters on logistics at Gallipoli, and I was pretty confident that I was able to find and read probably 95% of the material that existed on logistics at Gallipoli. I then did a chapter on And that probably was, I don't know, 500 pages of stuff. Now, I then went and did a chapter on logistics during the Second World War in 1944-45. And I just scraped the surface of the records for that. And I probably read 4,000 pages of records. And now it's just another level still working on contemporary operations. Because they're digitally created, they're pumping out these records quicker. There's templates, so sort of fill in the form and send it off. So you just have so much material to get through. So records access and then arrangement and organising it has been, I think, a real challenge. Another thing, and this I keep going back to the First World War because it's where I started my sort of my career, and it's probably what you and many of your listeners are familiar with because they would have researched their family history and looked at service records and things. But records are kept very differently now than they were in the past. So records were more personalised in the First World War. So you might be reading about a division or a brigade or a battalion's attack at wherever it might be, Gallipoli or the Western Front. And those unit diaries and their service papers are much more personal than the records we see today, where people, unless they are seriously wounded or killed or are written up for a gallantry award, unless it meets those criteria, they're almost wholly written out of the record. So you don't know who you're reading about. And you're talking about much smaller groups of formations and units. So rather than corps and divisions in the First World War, we're talking about here, 5, 10, 15, 20 guys, rather than thousands. And it's harder to see the individual in that story now than it was 100 years ago. So that's a real challenge in mindset from a historian's perspective about how you can still get the individual into that story. On the flip side, because actions that we're writing about are much smaller or involve fewer people, you can interview many people who are involved in a particular action. Once you find out one who was there, you can tend to find out another 2 or 3 who were there as well. And that would have been harder from the First World War. So there's these challenges. And I think a third challenge would probably be the challenge of time. So there is a view that we're writing the official histories of Iraq, Afghanistan, and East Timor. So they're the conflicts we're writing about in our team. There's a view that we might be doing that too soon after the events. And if we think about Afghanistan, we've still got soldiers in Afghanistan, and we're writing about the war in Afghanistan that hasn't finished yet. And I think that they're good points to make, but a flip side to that, and certainly from a historian's perspective, is these are a long time ago, and relying on things like oral history when the written record is a bit problematic. Memory does funny things 2 decades after the event, and it does funny things 2 weeks after an event or 2 hours after an event. But the longer we leave it, the harder it is to use those as an active primary source. So that's a real challenge as well. But none of them are insurmountable, and you work with them. And I don't know that the challenges are any greater than they have been for historians writing about any topic, or for previous official historians. But they're new challenges that I think have taken a while to adopt our own, or certainly from my perspective, adopt my own working practices. How I sit down and get through the mountains of material that are in front of me, and analyze that and make sense of it and write it. I have to do that differently now than the way I did for my PhD.
Absolutely. And it's interesting in what you say there. And as the listeners would know, Rhys, that Afghanistan is our longest war, but it's probably our least and lesser understood war in a sense.
Yeah, I agree. And partly that's because we didn't tell the Australian government and the Australian Defence Force didn't tell the Australian public very much about what was happening. And that's, that gets to the point where, I started the official history of Afghanistan knowing pretty much nothing about Afghanistan. And And I'd say, I was interested in finding out as much as I could. But until the day that it became my full-time job and I was able to devote 100% of my attention to it, it's hard to know anything or be able to piece any of this together. And we haven't been particularly well served by successive governments in informing the public. Journalists haven't been let into Afghanistan in the numbers that they were in previous wars. That evolved a bit over the war. But because you don't have journalists regularly there, or the same journalists there, or journalists who are particularly close with the military, it's made it harder to understand that. And of course, there are exceptions. There are some journalists who have done wonderful jobs. And the best books we have on Australia and Afghanistan have actually been written by journalists, and they're very good books. And I think they stand up, for the most part, stand up to what I'm reading in the records that I have access to. But yeah, it's our longest war, and we still know very little about it.
Absolutely. In the future, do you see, Rhys, that the secrecy behind Afghanistan will actually be able to get an in-depth detail of what happened in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think I think our official histories will really help with that. So they'll sort of be not the first word. There's quite a bit out there if you go digging, but again, you've got to really be able to spend the time piecing it together. But ours will be the first consolidated and detailed account of what Australia did in Afghanistan. And so I think it'll be a starting point for people to then build off, for other historians to pick up from where we left off and realize, okay, they haven't done enough on this. They'll dig into that. I think time also will be a factor. So we'll see more veterans publish their stories as we get further away from the events. And I think the official histories will help with that as well. So a lot of veterans, I think, are a bit reticent to publish their stories because they've always been told sort of not to. The official histories will show them, I guess, what is no longer secret, because the official histories will be available to the public. So they will have gone through a process where the records we write from are still classified, and then the books will be published and the material in the books will be unclassified. So everyone will be able to read that and better understand it. The things I'm reading about, there's battles here that are made for movies. There's some phenomenal stories, and the Australian public will get to know them eventually, and they'll filter into, I think, our understanding of Australian military history in the same way that previous wars have. And we've had 30-odd thousand people deploy to Afghanistan or in support of the war in Afghanistan. That's a lot of stories and a lot of experiences, and they'll filter out eventually.
Absolutely. And a thought that's just come to my head, Rhys, as I've been listening, is that I guess, in a sense, after the First World War and the Second and all wars since, that for the general public, they would struggle to understand what had happened as each war has progressed to our current modern day, Afghanistan. Like, they would have been asking for, information on battles, and it's through the history that we've learnt. And I think it's a key aspect that you're doing, is that eventually the public will get some answers on Afghanistan and why it was so important that we did go over and deploy to Afghanistan.
Yeah, Adam, I think there's some really key things that the Australian public deserves to know, and the histories obviously will engage with this. And one of the main questions is, why were we there? And this is the same question that needs to be asked of Iraq, and the same questions that will be asked of any conflict in which Australia is involved. So why were we there? What did we do, and how did we do it? And it takes, I think, official histories and projects like we're doing that are well funded and have the time to spend reading, all of this material and interviewing all of these people that we can, to try and make sense of that. And you'd think that's from the outside, people might think that's a pretty easy process, but the fact that there isn't a narrative that exists I can't just go and pick a book off the shelf and go, oh, this is how this war unfolded. We've got to try and figure out that narrative as we go, and look for cause and effect and things like that. But that's why I think the Australian government, the successive Australian governments now for a century, deserve credit for commissioning these things, because the Australian public votes for these governments and they send our defence forces to war, and people die, and people's lives are changed as a result. So we deserve to know more, and that's what we're trying to do. And then eventually, and not too far in the future, these things will be available, and people can spend their time trying to get a better appreciation for why we were there, what we did, and how we did it.
Absolutely. And in a sense, for you and the team, Rhys, it's the work you guys are doing is you're in uncharted territory, because it's all new.
Yeah, well, it's new to us. It's not new to the people who deployed. But yes, that question you asked before about some of the challenges, they're new challenges we've had to face. And, you talk to other historians about how they've dealt with challenges in their own careers, and you talk to the veteran community about what they did, and you just try and figure it out in the time that we've got to write the histories. So, unlike Bean, we don't have decades to write these things. The team was well funded, and we've got a big team. I think we've got 17 people, a mixture of full-time and part-time support staff. But we're expected to finish the history in 5 years. That's blown out now to 6.5 years. But that's only 2 years away. We've been going for quite a while. So we've got time to contend with, and we've got to finish it in the next 2 years.
So how do you, as like you and the team, like talking about you've got 2 years to go, how do you balance keeping the official records and doing your job as a historian academically? How does that to not be rushed to then finish it on that deadline? What happens if you do go past that deadline?
I don't think going past the deadline's an option. We set our own benchmarks, and we produce chapters at a pretty quick pace. There's some downsides, I think, to producing that quickly. So at the moment, my colleagues and I, we're expected to sort of produce a chapter every 6 weeks, and they tend to range from about 10 to 15,000 words, and that's hard to do. And you have to miss things in that period, and it's just an unfortunate reality of the fact that at the end of the 5 years, or now 6.5 years, the money runs out and you stop getting paid, and none of us are rich enough to work for free. So, we'll have to move on to whatever the next step is in our career, or whatever that might be. So we have to work as a team to get these things finished. Ideally, you'd have forever. You'd be like Charles Bean, and you could write these things for 2 decades. But the project isn't funded for that, and you've got to draw a line at some point. And I think this was not a challenge to begin with, but it just took accepting the fact that, and I completely accept this. The role of a historian is to engage in a conversation, really. So when any history is a product of the time in which it's produced. So we'll produce our books, and the war in Afghanistan might still be occurring. It certainly is at the moment. And then in 30 years' time, the conclusions that could be drawn from that might be different. Or we could wait 30 years for the war to be over, and it mightn't be over yet. We don't know. We can't predict what's going to happen. But someone will come along, other historians will come along, and they will read what I've written, and they will say he got that wrong, or I don't think he unpacked this in the way that he should have, or in the detail that he should have, and they'll correct it, and they'll write other books, and then we improve from there. I got a PhD because I was critical of Charles Bean, so someone will come along and do that. I hope someone comes along and does that to my volumes. You don't like to be told you're wrong, but you will inevitably get things wrong. given the time restraints on writing, given the amount of material we've got to get through, given the fact that you can't talk to everyone and the books will come out and someone will say, but hang on, I was there, and, it unfolded differently.
Absolutely.
So over time, as long as your ego's okay with that, which mine is, then, the history will improve, and, we'll keep learning more about Afghanistan for decades to come.
Absolutely. So would you agree that bias is always a challenge for historians, and each historian has their own personal bias? What would you consider your personal bias to be, and how do you minimize them so that the project is as objective as possible?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think bias is there, and if we say it isn't, we're kidding ourselves as historians. It's inevitably there. I think it's just trying to be conscious of that. So the second part of your question on asking what my biases are, I reflect on them pretty regularly. I guess I'll discuss one because it's something that was new to my experience of being a historian. So I read about the First World War after the last soldiers had died. So I never spoke to any First World War soldiers. Now I speak to soldiers from Afghanistan or officers from Afghanistan on an almost daily basis, and many of them I've become friends with. I've probably interviewed, or my volumes interviewed about 500 people. So inevitably you like some of them, and inevitably you don't like some of them, and so you've got to keep that in mind. So I'm writing about people, and I've got to say good things and bad things about them, and they could be my friends. And so that's something that I'm conscious of, acutely conscious of. I think, and it's a new challenge for me because I hadn't had to do that to the extent that I'm having to do it now. I think there's some pros that come with that. One is a matter of empathy. So I think knowing the people helps with that empathy, as distinct from sympathy. But I'm empathetic with what they're going through because I think I understand the situation better than I would if I was just relying on, say, reading diaries that they'd kept during the First World War, because I can talk to them and I can tease out things, and we can have a chat both on the record or off the record, and I can just sort of spend the time trying to understand things. So I think it helps with that aspect. But there's also the flip side, that it could lead to swaying what you write about them. And so pretty conscious of that, and we'll have processes in place internal to the project and external to the project as well to try and, I guess, combat that as much as possible. So I won't personally interview my friends. I will have members of my staff do that. Everything I write is read internally in the project, and so I will flag to my colleagues if I want them to pay particular attention to how I deal with person X, and tell me whether they think there's a balance there that's not warranted. And I also get other people to read them, so people with security clearances, because what we're writing obviously is still classified. But people from the deployments to read those. And in particular, if I've been critical of someone in a chapter or chapters, which I am, and is expected of us, I'll get that person where possible to come and have a look at that, and we'll discuss it, and we'll correspond, and we put that material on file so it's available, so that if I maintain my point and it's contrary to their view of things, I'll acknowledge that in the history and say, person X didn't agree with this. However, I maintain my conclusions, and their correspondence is on file XYZ, and a member of the public one day will be able to read that. And that keeps me accountable, keeps my conclusions accountable, and shows that there's a difference of opinion there. So yeah, just trying to be conscious of those biases, and working with them, and you're doing the best you can, really.
Absolutely. And as I said earlier, Rhys, it's it's a task that you and your team, I absolutely take my hat off to you for what you were doing. It's absolutely a hard task, but I'm sure it will shine through, as does Charles Bean's official history from the First World War. I think it's going to be fantastic when it actually comes out. So I take my hat off to you and the team, mate. So well done.
Yeah, thank you.
So, can you tell us a bit about the other people involved in the official history project and their backgrounds and what they're focusing on?
Yeah, so as I said, Craig Stockings, or Professor Craig Stockings, is the official historian. So he's the boss of the whole thing. He is an academic. He's a professor at University of New South Wales in Canberra, so Australian Defence Force Academy, and a former Army officer. So he heads the whole thing, and he is writing the book, the first volume on the East Timor commitment, so looking at Interfet predominantly. And he's finished that book. And so he spends his time now, I guess, keeping the rest of us on track and providing feedback on what we're doing. The other 5 authors, so we've got 2 volumes on East Timor, and then a volume on Iraq and 3 volumes on Afghanistan. The historians are a mixture. We're all professional historians, but it's a mixture of backgrounds. So some are academics, like myself, so I come from an academic background. Others have been historians in the Royal Australian Navy or the Australian Army, so the historians for those services. And we've got a former, I guess he's still a senior historian at the Australian War Memorial, so Stephen Bullard. So he was working in the military history section before he came to our current project, and he's worked on official histories before as well. So yeah, there's the authors, and then we've got a bunch of support staff. So everyone has research assistants. So they're in the past they've been PhD qualified. Currently, we've got some PhD students, so people going through the process of hopefully being awarded PhDs in history. We've got some ex-service personnel, and we've got some staff from the Army and from the Air Force who are reservists who are provided to us by the services, basically extra hands on deck to help us get through what is a big task. And then we have some administrative and support staff, as well as, the rest of the War Memorial that provides some element of support. So, obviously all the IT and HR and all of that sort of stuff that sits behind being an employee. And we all sort of work together as a big team, writing these volumes, and then as smaller teams. So the East Timor lot branch out and sort of focus on their books, and Iraq and Afghanistan sort of work as one big team, and then within that there's obviously smaller teams working on their own volumes. But I guess the one thing we all have in common is an appreciation for the importance of official history. We see it as crucial. For me, I think it's is pinnacle, and is the pinnacle of doing this sort of stuff. It's all at the start of my career, so I don't know where the career is going to go after this. But I just think it's crucially important to be able to do these and provide as objective accounts of these wars as we can. Again, answering those questions I said before of why we were there, what we did, and how we did it, and probably another one: what did it all mean? If we can answer those in a lot of detail, then we've done our job.
Absolutely. And I think that last question, I think that's, as you say, it's probably one of the most important questions of why were we there? Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head there. So for you interviewing current and former ADF personnel who were in Afghanistan, how have they been with forthcoming for the project and telling their stories, and when they have told their stories, how do you see future veterans coming forward and their stories being told? Yeah,
the interviews is a really important part of what we do. So I said before, some of the challenges of relying on interviews given the time, but they're still a really useful source. It can sort of send you down research paths that you wouldn't have considered beforehand. They might say, hey, this was a really significant day, or this was a really significant week or action, or whatever it might be. And we can focus in on that, given just how many records there are. You can't read everything. But people are very forthcoming. I think partly that's because it's the Australian War Memorial, so I think people see that brand and are keen to be involved with it. And but partly it's also because as the official historians and with the sort of being appointed by government and having security clearances, we can tell people that they're fine to talk to us. And so for Defence, for example, the Chief of Defence Force confirms his support for the project, and then current serving people, we can show them that and they go, okay, great, and they can talk to us. And so we can conduct interviews in a facility that allows us to talk about sensitive matters, and that's not something they could just do out in the public. So they can immediately talk to us about things they wouldn't be able to talk to elsewhere. And I find it really forthcoming. Only a few people have said no that we've approached to interview, and we've interviewed people from privates to prime ministers, and rarely do people say no. And people are really keen to get these stories told, and the good and the bad as well. So it's not everything's positive that we hear, and not everyone's experience of Afghanistan is positive. And certainly there's some horrible things you hear about what people have been through and what they've seen. And that can be pretty daunting, both to listen to, but more so, I think, for the people to talk about. But we record everything we do, and those recordings will be one day available to the public. They're still closed and not available at the moment, but we're sort of creating an archive as we go, and I think that's another important legacy of the official history. So we'll produce these whopping big books that hopefully lots of people read, but we'll also create an archive that one day will be available, and other historians will be able to pick through that. And I mean, it's massive. The archive we've created is just millions of documents, and they'll be able to use this. So personally, how I use an interview sort of varies, but let's say I do an interview that lasts 2 hours, I might only use a few sentences out of that. And if we were to write up a transcript, it might go to 40 pages. So most of what you hear is unused, but it kind of helps inform me and educate me about what I'm writing about, which I guess lets me, better understand whether what I'm reading and seeing and hearing is accurate or not. There's the BS meter that can go off. You talk to enough people and you can get a good feel for that. So I'll use it for sort of general information. Another way is to send me down those research paths that I wouldn't have considered otherwise. And the other is to add colour. So official records are pretty, as I said, they're depersonalised. They can also be pretty bland. Patrol went to this location, did this between these minutes, returned to base. It can sometimes be as basic as that. That's boring to read. So you use that as a foundation, and then you use the official records to sort of cross-check what you hear in the interviews. But the interviews will talk about, what the journey from point A to point B was like, and what they did on the ground, and what they saw, and what the weather was like, and what the atmospherics were like, and who was on their left and who was on their right. And so you can use that to start to create a story. And then you can bring those actions, I think, to life in a way that you just can't do if you rely wholly on written records. But as I said, we've always got to be careful. We've got to cross-check everything. We need multiple sources sort of before you can accept something as gospel. But yeah, one of the great legacies of this project will be the archive we leave behind. And I feel very fortunate to be able to interview these people because it's a great experience for me. It's fun, I get to hear some amazing stuff and meet some phenomenal people.
Absolutely. And I can back you up, Rhys, on that with my podcast. Interviewing veterans, it's one of the best parts of why I do the podcast, because their stories are fascinating. It's a real honor and a privilege for them to share their stories. And I feel very honored to actually listen to their stories and actually educate people and say, this is their story, this was their war, this was their experience. And it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and I think so many podcasts now are out there, and I'm not trying to plug others, but there's some really great ones out there that spend some, obviously a lot of resources and time on tracking down current veterans, and people are telling their stories, and those sources are phenomenal. I use them, so I'll hear a podcast, someone talking to a current veteran, and I take notes from it, and then we'll incorporate it potentially into the official history. So it's a great source.
Absolutely. So the official history that you're writing, is that purely based from an Australian perspective, or are you getting involvement from Afghan military and their personal historians, or is it just purely based Australian?
Yeah, so it's not wholly Australian, but it's mostly Australian. So we sort of have this feeling that will provide enough context, or just enough context, to make wider sense of what is happening around Australia's contribution. There's a real sort of challenge, and I'm sort of not convinced that I'll do this well enough to the extent that I wish I could. There's a real criticism, again, going back to Charles Bean, and I level this on Bean in my first book, where you could read it and almost think that there's no one else at Gallipoli than the Australians. So we've got to really be careful not to create that impression about Afghanistan, because Australia's contribution in Afghanistan, in the bigger scheme of things, is tiny. It's not insignificant, but it's a really small part of a much bigger war. And the tone of that war and the approach taken in that war is taken by others, and Australia sort of goes along for the most part with that. So Australia works as part of a coalition in one province called Guion province, from 2005 to 2014, worked in that one province. But then there's all these other provinces in Afghanistan, and there's other coalition partners there, and the Americans are commanding the whole thing for the most part. Again, it's not quite as simple as that. Obviously, things change over time. But one of the challenges is trying to remind the reader that all this other stuff is happening, and that's it's really difficult to do, because we only have so many words, and you're trying to tell a detailed story about Australia and Afghanistan. So I'm not convinced I'll do that to the extent I hope or I think that I wished I would be able to do. So and I grapple with that every day, and it really bugs me. But at the end of the day, it's an official history of Australia's contribution to that war. I spent a bit of time pre-COVID overseas talking to those working on their nation's official histories. So US, Canada, UK, and Europe. There's a whole bunch of historians came together for a conference, and we spoke about our own approaches to official history, or their equivalents, and where they're at. And many of them haven't started and don't know when they will start. But I think the consensus is, for most of us, it's a challenge that we all face, is telling our national stories in a bigger context. And I suspect what will actually happen is we will all give our pretty detailed national histories, without it being nationalistic, I guess, in a sense of wasn't Australia great at won the war kind of thing, which you can get out of the First World War official history. So staying away from that. But if we all produce those detailed histories, then other historians will be able to come along and sort of grab a bunch of nations' official histories and then figure out what it all means larger. Your question about Afghans, I just remembered you asked that. So the Afghan story is a massive gap. We know little about the other side, so the Taliban or Al Qaeda. there's material there, but you can use it where possible, but not in any meaningful way, certainly not for our project. And getting the Afghan story is a really difficult one. So often you're dealing with people who are dead these days, who you can't track down, and to a large extent, the Afghan component of Australia's war in Afghanistan will be in the background, and that's a shame. I think it's a reality of writing about this conflict, and certainly a reality of not having sort of conducted all those interviews at the time in the theatre. So some excellent books on Afghanistan's war, but they're written by people who conducted interviews, lived in Afghan villages, and conducted interviews at the time while the war was going on, and so you could do that. But there's only a handful of those, and they are phenomenal histories. We don't have the same source material that they did, and thankfully they did that work, because we just, I think it's a challenge we're all facing, and the answer will be we just don't really, we won't have a full grasp of the Afghan story of the Afghan war.
Absolutely, and I just wanted to put that in there because I feel that it's throughout history, Rhys, we tend to do it. We only look from one side. We don't ever look from the other side. We don't look at it as a whole. We only ever look at history from our side of our men who went, and that it's a real shame, because what our perspective is very different to the other side's perspective on the war, on all wars.
Yeah, and I think we will be guilty of that to a large extent as well, unfortunately. Wish we could do better, but it's hard, and trying to find the answers to that takes more time than we've got available, and
Yep.
And a lot of resources, and a level of expertise and language expertise that we don't have. So we talk to as many people as we can who have expertise in Afghanistan as a place and Afghan people, in a way that that I don't. I don't pretend to have studied Afghanistan for generations. So we spend time talking to those experts, and using their work to the best way we can. But I think, to a large extent, the history will be a history from one side of the hill, and and that will be it'll be what it is, and wish it could be different.
Absolutely, it's a shame, but at the end of the day, Rhys, you and the team are doing the best you can with the resources you've got.
Yeah, we're trying.
Absolutely. So, whilst researching Australia's role in Afghanistan, is there one story that's really touched you, and if possible, could you share it with us?
Yeah, lots of them have an impact for different reasons. And many of the things that touch me are the experiences I have in an interview. So, as I said, they can get pretty emotional, both for myself and for the subject who's spilling the beans and telling their story. And so those memories stick with me, and often they're captured on the recording. People are really quite upset about what they're talking about. So that sticks with me. As for events, there's lots. There's an episode which I think is amazing, of Australian Chinook crews flying into an area in 2006 to rescue basically a helicopter full, or two helicopters full of wounded Canadians who have been strafed by the US jet. So they fly into the danger zone and pick up these people and transport them back to hospital. I think, it's a small episode, but that stood out as being something pretty amazing and different. Another example of Australian Chinooks again. And the Australian Chinooks is a pretty small component of the Australian experience of the war, but flying another nation's assault force in to target a member of the Taliban, and they get fired on when they're flying in, and they drop off this coalition force, who then have a massive fight, and then the Chinooks later come back through fire and pick them up. and certainly saved their lives as a result of that. So that story, which I tell in a heap of detail in the history, stands out as pretty amazing. With that same story is another kind of separate story involving an Australian Commando platoon. So they're on the ground while the Chinooks are obviously flying in the air. And they fight into an area to allow that coalition partner to extract from a really dangerous place back to those Chinooks so they can get out of there. And then the Australian Commando platoon has to fight its way out of an area completely outnumbered. And they do so sort of 5 or 6 hours. And they essentially run out of ammunition, and the aircraft that's in support of them runs out of ammunition. And they just keep running into ambushes and pushing through those ambushes and taking out machine guns. And some of the individual stories associated with that operation, are as gallant as you will ever hear and read about. They're just amazing. Most of which were acknowledged through the honours and awards system, including the first Star of Gallantry. And I've been really fortunate to interview that individual and interview a lot of other people who were there for that particular night. So that sticks with me. But for the most part, and there's so many others, and there's a bunch I haven't even learnt about yet. So I've got 2 years to go, and I'm still learning about these things as I go through the records. I think rather than events themselves, I guess there's some themes that have kind of stuck with me. And one is just how busy the Australian Defence Force was across this time, both in Afghanistan, but also more broadly. So Iraq is happening at the same time. We've got troops in East Timor. Solomon Islands is an issue. There's humanitarian missions that are occurring. There's just so much stuff happening. And then in Afghanistan itself, it's just constant operations. And I hadn't appreciated that when I started the project, just the intensity of combat and the intensity of those experiences. I don't think, to some extent, aren't replicated or aren't reflected, in the casualty figures. I mean, we lost 41 Australians killed and 260 plus wounded, and more than that with mental scars from it. But to some extent, I think those numbers are even smaller than what you would expect from what we've been seeing in the records. The prevalence of improvised explosive devices on roads and the damage they do to vehicles and more so to people is horrific. But if it weren't for Australian Bushmaster vehicles, we would have lost more people killed in those accidents. If it wasn't for medical evacuation and getting out of places quickly on a helicopter and back to a hospital quickly, we would have lost more people. So the ability to treat people quickly, and the fact that there's just so many aircraft and things in support of troops on the ground, means that the numbers, I don't think, reflect just how intense that experience was. And that will be something that readers get from reading these official histories, just how busy the ADF was across the board, but in particular in Afghanistan. And that's really shocked me. And the other thing I think has been just the complexity of the war in Afghanistan. So I said before, we're a small coalition partner in a much larger coalition, and that broader story across time is a complicated one, and it's one that should be understood in all its complexity and its nuance. There's no point simplifying it because it's not simple, and it influences what Australians are doing on the ground every day. So I think all of those things together make for a really fascinating history, but also I think will be really surprising to people in the way they've been surprising to me. They'll surprise the public when they get to understand the war in Afghanistan to a much greater extent than they do now.
Absolutely. And I think, Rhys, I think for the public, it's going to be a way to actually truly understand what went on over there, because it's still so much is to know about the fighting that went on over there. And as we said, it was at the start of the podcast, it's it's one of the longest wars. Well, sorry, it is our longest war. And like you said, more than 30,000 troops deployed to Afghanistan and 41 lost their lives. But for us to have the freedoms that we enjoy today, all we can say is thank you for their service. They did a fantastic job, and I'm actually looking. I can't wait to read the official history, mate, and I can't wait for you guys to finish the work. And I can see how you enjoy it. I can see the smile on your face. Like it's it is a great it's a great project, and you guys should be very proud of what you do.
Yeah, it's an honour. It's great fun. But your listeners clearly have an interest in Australian military history. That's why they've tuned into the podcast. They can go up on Anzac Day, when COVID allows us to all catch up again. They should go up to people that are wearing medals and ask them, not rudely, and they might say no, they don't want to talk about it, but say, hey, I'm really interested in learning about your experience. Can you tell me a little bit about it? And it's sort of incumbent on us all. We talk to our grandfathers or whatever generation, and they spoke to these people, or at least their experiences were front of mind. And I think it doesn't take a lot of effort individually to learn a little bit more about it. And these are people that are our age or younger, and and I think they want to talk. They certainly want to talk to me about it. So, and I'm not alone.
Absolutely. And I think for the veterans who, Rhys, and yourself, if they get that you care, and show a genuine interest in their story, they are willing to share their stories with you. And you can show compassion, whether you've been in the military or whether or not you've got family that's been in the military. If you show that you care and you're passionate about their story, most of them will tell you their stories.
Yep, too right.
So, and I think, Rhys, it's a great way to finish the podcast. And I thank you for coming on True Blue History and just telling us about the Australia's involvement in Afghanistan and the work that you and your team are doing to write the official history. And mate, it's been fantastic, and we'll definitely get you back on the show. So, Dr. Rhys Crawley, thank you very much for coming on True Blue History.
Cheers, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcast. If you would like to support us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/True Blue History, or via Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/True Blue History. The links will be in the description below. And check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more information about the podcast.